Shall we begin? All set? Great. All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Jim Sherry. I'm here at the CUNY Center for Immigrant, Refugee, and Global Health. It's my great pleasure today to introduce one of our very special collaborators, Dr. Jasmin Lilian Diab. Dr. Diab's a scholar and expert in migration, gender, and conflict studies. As the director of the Institute for Migration Studies at Lebanese American University. She also serves there as an assistant professor and coordinator for migration studies. She's got a luminous past, and she's been developing a very impressive resume. She was the first global fellow of migration and inequality at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. That was back, actually not that long ago, I guess just a year ago, right? And she's also been a research affiliate at the Center for Refugee Studies at York University, a global fellow at Brown University's Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies, and a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge in the Center for Lebanese Studies. The Institute of Migration Studies, which she heads, is a collaborator of our center, and there she provides deep expertise at the intersection of health, refugee, and gender studies. The joint activity research study currently underway is looking at the impact of gender identity on access to healthcare services for the registered Syrian refugee community in Lebanon's northern regions. And as an extension of this collaboration, we're very pleased here to be hosting her, Dr. Diab, today on this particular webinar focused on the implications of sexual violence and harassment on migrant domestic workers' mental health in Lebanon. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Diab. It is my equally great pleasure to introduce my colleague and director of our Center for Immigrant, Refugee, and Global Health, Dr. Kathleen Cravero, who will be serving as our moderator today. So with that, I turn it to you, Jasmin and Kathleen, to take it away.
Good. I'll just say a couple of words, which is that we are so pleased to have Jasmin here. We have been collaborating with Jasmin for over the last 2 years, and really have learned so much from her, constantly intimidated by what she knows and how she writes it and the dissemination of her expertise. But we've been learning a lot and really value the collaboration. Know that her time is very precious, so I'm very grateful that she took the time to be with us today. So I know that Jasmin wants a very interactive session, so she will be speaking, sharing, and I think she will stop at certain points if people want to put questions in the chat then, but please be registering your questions as Jasmin speaks, and then at various points we can raise some of the issues that are coming up in the chat so that she can respond to them in real time. So over to you, Jasmin.
Wow, thank you. Thank you both so much for such a generous introduction. I'm equally as honored and happy to be part of the series and to be working with you all at our institute. We discuss our ongoing research a lot. As Professor Kathleen said, we are working diligently on this project at the moment, and I'm very happy that we've been able to collaborate on this webinar as well. Today, my talk will hopefully center on a few things, predominantly migrant mental health, but also discuss a little bit of the work at our institute that we do and how this presentation came about and what the lengthy study actually that we carried out brings to the table when we talk about migrant mental health and particularly migrant domestic workers in Lebanon. So migration is a contemporary and complex phenomenon, and the main intention behind it is often betterment or escaping non-favorable factors. For many migrants that have no proper preparation, no social support, with complexities present and barriers present, there is definitely an insurmountable amount of distress, whether this is international migration or internal migration. Research studies that we've conducted have shown that most of the time migration is a vulnerable factor to the development of mental health complications, whether this be for migrant domestic workers, whether this be for refugee groups that we work with, or whether this be for IDPs, internally displaced persons, or even stateless groups as well. So due to the insecurity attached with migration, the non-availability of their own community members, the distress would turn into mental health consequences or other forms of health complications. Typically, these health complications are mental health implications from our work and from our understanding, but they can of course extend to physical health complications as well. So our studies have pointed out that local and international efforts to respond to these problems remain, of course, inadequate, remain deficient, and this is particularly true for the Lebanese case. We can delve as much as you'd like into the intersectional crisis that Lebanon is currently undergoing at the moment. And beyond that, there is an immense need for accessible, affordable, and public health services, whether this be for physical or mental health. And these services, in the context that we operate, remain very exclusive, remain very elitist, and remain very racist and discriminatory, unfortunately, as well. So there is a wide scope of research studies that investigate how to make this correlation between migration and mental health and what some of the impacting factors are. And this brings us to our study with migrant domestic workers in Lebanon. So about a year ago, we carried out an exhaustive study with an organization called Enya Lenya Besidet, which is a migrant domestic worker-led organization based in Lebanon, and that works in close collaboration and through funding from the International Labor Organization, the ILO. We decided at our institute to focus on this group predominantly because, as you know, and maybe if you're familiar with Lebanon a bit, when we discuss migration, we automatically turn our conversation to the refugee conversation. We turn our conversation to the brain drain conversation. This is largely a migrant group that has slipped between the cracks in the areas of research. And no matter how much research is carried out on this community, the complexity of this community, the diversity within this community really warrants a lot more research, particularly when we speak about their health. So let me tell you a little bit more about how these groups of migrant domestic workers, 90% of which are women, are governed in our legal system in Lebanon, how the system in place isolates them, and what the implications of this are on their mental health. So migrant domestic workers in Lebanon are governed under the kafala system. Kafala is a word that loosely means a sponsorship system. And this is a system that gives private citizens and companies in countries like Lebanon, but also Jordan and other Arab Gulf countries, almost total control over migrant domestic workers' employment and immigration status. The system arose a few decades ago because there was a growing demand in the Gulf for cheap labor, and the desperation of many migrants from very developing parts of the world. This correlation really created this type of system that we have. The kafala system at the moment, for those of you that are maybe a little bit more up to date on recent events in the news and that was people that were following the World Cup, a lot of the conversations around hosting the World Cup in Qatar had to do with the legal pretenses under which migrant domestic workers were brought into the country. So the kafala system has been compared by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and other international organizations to modern day slavery. And this system not only puts a strain on these migrant workers' physical and mental health, but it largely disconnects them entirely from access to services, access to justice, access to protection. It essentially isolates them either in the homes of their employers or in the companies or facilities in which they work. So I would like to discuss exactly how a system, how this legal framework that isolates this group impacts not only their mental health in the long term, but also perpetuates for other violations to take place. So we began discussing migrant domestic workers' mental health following this really big landmark study that we completed with Enya Lenya that we talked about. In our study, we attempted to highlight migrant domestic workers' experiences. We wanted to understand why the self-harm rates were very high within the community, why suicide rates were very high, and why negative coping mechanisms were also high as well. So we carried out one of the biggest studies on sexual harassment and sexual violence nationwide in Lebanon, and we made a point of interviewing close to 1,000 migrant domestic workers in the country. There hadn't been studies up to that point that gave the community that much weight. There hadn't been studies that took into account the national diversities of these people, really lumping migrant domestic workers together, even though they come from 20 plus different nationalities. And we used, of course, in-depth interviews to speak to these women. Each of these interviews, each of these 1,000 interviews took us about an hour and a half each. So this yielded a direct pattern that began with the legal framework that marginalizes the group, the kafala system, the abuse of power perpetuated as a result, followed by the sexual harassment and the violence that these women encounter, and then, of course, mental health. So this was our walkthrough in the study and how our findings connected this migration status, this volatile, vulnerable system to mental health as well. So when asked about whether or not they had survived at least one incident of sexual harassment during their employment or stay in Lebanon, 68% of our respondents informed the study that they had. And according to respondents, the various forms of sexual harassment and violence included everything from inappropriate staring or leering in a sexual manner to sexually aggressive comments or jokes or name calling, everything from intrusive questions about sex, someone showing their private parts to another person, unwelcome touching, hugging, kissing, etc. Sexually implicit calls or messages. We also had women tell us about repeated or inappropriate invitations to dates, to sexual activity. They were sent sexually explicit pictures by their employers. And there were also several accounts of actual or attempted rape or sexual assault, as well as requests or pressure for sex or other sexual acts to be committed. So 56.2% of the sample, around 513 women of the women we interviewed, insisted that they had experienced at least one of the aforementioned forms of sexual assault. And the remaining 11.7%, which is how we got to our total 68%, confirmed that they had experienced sexual assault, but they weren't really willing to describe their experience to us in detail, or they were really incapable of identifying exactly what type of violation that was. So following our conversations with these women on the different perpetuations of sexual violence against them, they highlighted a multitude of negative implications on their mental health and their physical health, of course, as a result of sexual harassment in all its forms. The negative implications on their mental health that we found in our study included thoughts about self-harm, anxiety, substance abuse, sleeping disorders, stress and depression, as well as eating disorders, isolation and withdrawal from society, suicidal thoughts and tendencies, and other implications, usually outlined as an overall sense of constantly living in fear or constantly living in a feeling of insecurity as well. So despite the overwhelming findings that the study highlights, the mental health strains that migrant domestic workers endure as a result of all of the sexual harassment and assault did not lead to these women actually resorting to any form of mental health support. And according to our study, while it makes complete and total sense to presume that this reality is linked to the kafala system and the fact that these women are isolated from accessing these services, we also, interestingly enough, found that many of the women don't seek mental health support, therapy, counseling sessions, or see a psychologist because they view this process as a shameful and unnecessary process, which was a very interesting cultural phenomenon that we found among certain groups that we interviewed. A number of women highlighted their view that therapy and psychologists could only provide temporary relief without really addressing more structural and societal problems. And so it was interesting to see how this perception of mental health support, coupled with the fact that these women were very aware of structural and societal problems, really just had them take the idea of seeking any form of mental health support out of their minds. So when we asked them about coping mechanisms, many survivors of sexual harassment and violence in all its forms said that they had resorted to what they refer to as various forms of spiritual healing or to addressing, overcoming, and really managing their trauma on their own. So different testimonies from women we interviewed included journaling, prayer, meditation, and even group sessions with other survivors where possible, and where this was permitted by their employer as well. Fascinatingly enough, we interviewed a few women that said that in the household where they worked and lived, that the husband, quote unquote, committed a sexual act of violence against them. The wife, quote unquote, was aware of this, and the wife either did nothing or permitted her migrant domestic worker to go get mental health support. But then what are the options really that are there? And I think we can lay the foundation for a bit of a pause and some questions there. According to a team member who conducted fieldwork for our study, many of the women said that they were fine in a reactive tone when asked about their mental health, when asked about coping, when asked about their trauma. Her testimony, our fieldwork, our data collector, was that she felt as though it was as if trauma and anxiety caused by the events were not only played down, but also disregarded as too painful to remember. And if I am to wrap up, and I think maybe I'll keep it short for now, and we can of course dive into as many questions as you want. Kafala enables this type of abuse, and it restricts access to services and really traps people in poor mental health. As one respondent said to me, and I'd love to end on this quote, she said, living in the kafala system is like living in a waiting room to nowhere. And so this is my conclusion, I think. Please, by all means, any questions or comments, I'm ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jasmin. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the ages. Do the ages really vary? And did one nationality dominate, or was there really like just a little bit understanding a little bit more who these women are?
Mm-hmm. So one important point, I think, on age is a good thing to unpack. Many migrant domestic workers that want to come to Lebanon to work are known to forge their documents to make them seem older, right? So it's either that they pay a certain agency or a recruitment agency to deal with their paperwork, and then their age is modified on this paperwork to permit them to travel, or they actually do this themselves. So interestingly enough, we maintained that we interviewed women only above the age of 18 that could consent to being interviewed, even though a significant group of women that work with Enya Lanya, the organization that we conducted the study with, are between the ages of 14 and 17, and they've reported similar experiences in the past as well. Our study interviewed women between the ages of 18 and 62. I think our oldest interviewee was 62. And they were from multiple nationalities, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, the Philippines, even Iraq, even Sudan. We also interviewed women that were based at Enya Lanya. So very smaller groups of different nationalities. So Sri Lankan women as well constituted a big group of the sample. Interestingly enough, one of the biggest findings of our study was this conversation on fetishization, and how Black migrant domestic workers were really fetishized and were sexually harassed more frequently and more violently than other groups that were predominantly perceived as lighter skinned, so like Filipinas, for example. The most horrendous crimes that we heard from our interviewing and our data collection were perpetuated against Ethiopian women and Eritrean women. And this community has been known, unfortunately, to be placed in some kind of a hierarchy in the kafala system. So even more terribly so, I can share that if you go to an agency to hire a migrant domestic worker in Lebanon, hiring a migrant domestic worker, my God, this is so difficult to talk about. They are placed in a hierarchy based on their nationality. So if you want a Filipina migrant domestic worker, she is more expensive than a Sri Lankan domestic worker, who is more expensive than a Bangladeshi domestic worker, who is more expensive than Ethiopian and Eritrean domestic workers, which means that the social context and the groups of people that seek out these types of services will particularly go for a certain group based on their socioeconomic standing, believe it or not. And so it has been the experience of many Ethiopian and Eritrean women that we speak to, that they are placed in homes that don't have adequate facilities, where they don't have any privacy, where they are in poorer neighborhoods, where they sleep on kitchen floors, where they sleep on a couch, where they don't have their own rooms or their own bathrooms. And so these incidents are perpetuated at higher rates. Interestingly enough, the highest percentage of women that reported suicidal tendencies and self-harm were also Ethiopian in our study.
Thanks, Jasmine. We have a question about if these women were interested in mental health, more formal mental health services, were there any available, accessible? They obviously need the permission of their employer to access them, or do they? You know, what would have been if we could increase if you could increase the demand, what would be the supply of mental health services available?
I mean, it's interesting because in a context like Lebanon, already among the local population, conversations on mental health are so taboo and so disconnected from conversations on health in general. And mental health service provision, even for citizens, is not necessarily rampant and widespread and not necessarily even accessible to that extent. At the moment, if migrant domestic workers would like to seek out any form of mental health support, there are local organizations similar to the one we worked with, as well as organizations like the Anti-Racism Movement, the Migrant Community Center, Caritas, etc., largely NGOs that provide this type of support. But as you said, there are multiple barriers to this. So one barrier is the overall lack of information on mental health services and the perception among migrant domestic workers that these services are not only unhelpful, but that they are also very shameful and taboo. And also the second barrier to access would be definitely that they need the permission of their employer, not only to leave the house, but also to pay for these things in many cases. It's also quite expensive, right? If you want to seek this in a private capacity and not through NGOs. Interestingly enough, as part of our study, we found out that the majority of migrant domestic workers who do seek out mental health services from NGOs are largely women that have escaped their place of employment, that are undocumented, that are pretty much, surviving on their own in the country, and that are not, restricted by kind of this authority or this type of control as well. The reason why they're able to do this is because they operate outside the sponsorship system, albeit illegally, quote unquote, in the eyes of the law. They live and they work here on their own time, and they're not confined to the sponsorship system.
What happens to these women if they're found? They're immediately deported, or like?
Yes. Yeah. So they are arrested and then deported. Yes. Okay.
Because if not, then obviously there would be mass exodus from the kafala system. It seems. I mean, if you can successfully escape and stay, is your situation better?
I would say so. I would say at least in the areas of freedom of mobility, freedom to work where you'd like, etc. But you are essentially, yes, fleeing the law at every turn. So you're attempting not to have any point of contact with law enforcement, etc. Right? So the majority of the undocumented migrant domestic workers we spoke to, percentage-wise, were 60% less likely to seek out law enforcement in cases where they were raped, abused, harmed in any way. They didn't want any point of contact with authorities. And because of this point of vulnerability, because of the fact that the harasser or the perpetrator knows that this woman is likely undocumented and that she's not going to seek out this type of help, this makes not only the acts more violent, but it makes them more frequent. And this is why we found a direct correlation between strains on mental health and then being undocumented as well, which is a completely different, intersection of the study.
Right. We have another question about what you're feeling or what came out of the research about the system-wide or systemic or policy changes that would have to be in place to address this. And a related question was, did the women themselves have any suggestions about what could make their situation better?
Thank you so much for that question. Migrant domestic work is the only form of labor that is isolated from the labor law in all of the countries that have the kafala system, right? So it is the only type of labor that the Ministry of Labor does not oversee, where there are no official holidays, no official guarantees, no pension systems, etc. So the ultimate solution would certainly be for you to place migrant domestic work under this umbrella of the labor law, right? Similar to every foreign person working in the country in every other sector. Why does this sector specifically have to be isolated? And this is echoed by a lot of the women that we speak to. They say that a lot of the strains on their mental health and their well-being and their ability to really function is that they feel marginalized from the moment they enter the country. Everything acts against them. The system isolates them, the law isolates them, and you're essentially not just coming to a country where you hardly speak the language and you don't know what to expect. You're also coming into the country in this overall understanding that you should be afraid, right? That no one is there to protect you. So it is essentially a leap of desperation and faith for many of these women that come to Lebanon to work and to the GCC as well. As one of the women actually said to us, she said, we arrive in a feeling of insecurity already. We are very insecure upon arrival. We are scared, we are stressed. Our mental health upon arrival is detrimental. You can only imagine after a succession of traumatizing incidents where you can't access the law, you can't access any mental health support, what kind of a standing we would be in 10 years after we come to Lebanon as well. So yes, I mean, to answer your question, their suggestion, as is the suggestion of activists, myself, human rights advocates as well, is that migrant domestic law be placed under labor law and also be carefully monitored, similar to everyone else's job under the Ministry of Labor in these countries as well.
Okay, we have another question about what about allies in the regional or international sphere, like the Organization of Islamic States, WHO, UNICEF? Everybody just stands by and watches this go on, or is there advocacy at that level to do something?
There's certainly advocacy at that level to do something, particularly in Lebanon and in the region. The ILO, the International Labor Organization, spearheads all of these conversations on justice in the labor system, justice for people that are governed under the kafala law, and also have sat down with authorities, with governments to actually discuss the kafala system and how to abolish it or actually at least make drastic amendments to it. In Lebanon specifically, the ILO came very close to actually coming to a deal with the Ministry of Labor. They called it a deal because it never really went through. It never made it to a directive or a law or a policy. They came to an agreement with the Ministry of Labor to improve the conditions, the working conditions for migrant domestic workers, namely vacations, namely increase in pay, namely preventing individuals who sponsor migrant domestic workers to take their documents and their passports and their papers away, because this is what they do as well. And this conversation came right before things really got bad in Lebanon, right before the protests and the demonstrations and the revolution and the economic crisis. And so it kind of fell, between the cracks, and no one really talked about it anymore. As for other organizations, they do, I would say, work in the areas of advocacy and lobbying, not as strictly and as specifically as the ILO and even IOM as well in the country. But they are at the forefront of supporting, mental health support. Even we're at the front of discussing migrant domestic workers and refugee groups' access to the COVID vaccine, et cetera. So UN agencies do a lot of the advocacy and the lobbying, but I would say they haven't been able to cross that line yet, right? Of turning it into policy or a directive or really instilling, something tangible that could protect these women. A few years ago in Lebanon, Law 205 was seen as groundbreaking. It was a sexual harassment law. And even though the law said that it would apply to every person on the Lebanese territory, again, these structural challenges, these confines of the kafala system and the isolating of different groups prevents them from accessing it. So sometimes it's not just about the law being there or the UN agencies talking about it or different organizations lobbying for it or discussing it. Everything has to come together at once, right? The legal frameworks, the political will, and also, this advocacy as well. So I hope I answered your question. I'm happy to unpack that a little more if you'd like.
Okay, maybe a related question has been, how do you address the kind of social views, the general view that within Lebanese society that this is okay? You know, that the system is okay, and it's okay that there's one group of workers that aren't under the law, and are there advocates or organizations that are trying to go directly to citizens of Lebanon to point out what's going on, or to try to change the normalization of this system?
I think it's very interesting to have these conversations in a country like Lebanon because of the rampant culture of impunity across the country in general. At the moment, Lebanon stands as a country that is arguably, according to international organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, almost a failed state entirely. Our ministries don't function, our directorates don't function, and as of this morning, our currency continues to devaluate each and every single day. Amid this environment, and amid environments prior to this that were not quite better, people in Lebanon are accustomed to this culture of impunity and this lack of legal consequence when it comes to them committing these little crimes, what they perceive are little crimes. Because the kafala system protects the individual that sponsors these migrant domestic workers and hires them, and because of the fact that kafala is the law, unfortunately, I think it's a very perfect example of when the law is the problem, right? So if it's the law, it doesn't make it right. Because sponsors and perpetuators of these crimes are able to use this law in order to defend themselves, in order to get out on bail, in order to get away with everything that they are committing. Because this is the case, there is a lot of repercussions that just these next steps, they just don't happen. So a migrant domestic worker would go to the internal security forces and report a crime, report that she was attacked, report that she was harmed, report that her paperwork was taken away. And as soon as they find out who this individual's sponsor is, she is returned to their homes, right? She is returned to the home of the sponsor. So this understanding of, again, this culture of impunity really has cemented this social phenomenon. It's become really part of the social fabric, unfortunately. And there's a lot of entitlement attached to having a migrant domestic worker in Lebanon and in the region as well. In Lebanon, you will find that there are people that live in small homes that don't have the space for a migrant domestic worker, that have 5 or 6 family members that barely fit in the house as it is, and yet they do have a migrant domestic worker, right? You'll find that these are people that can barely pay the bills, that can barely make ends meet, that can barely put gas in their car, but they have a migrant domestic worker, right? So it's a lot of the cultural understanding and the social understanding of why this is okay, before we talk about, of course, the racism and the discrimination attached to that. It is a very, I would say, slavery-based approach, as Human Rights Watch deems it. And I think changing these societal views, unfortunately, will not only take a lot of time, but it will take a lot of prioritization that in Lebanon, I don't foresee in the near future as well. Neither do the women we speak to. So in order for this to change, there would have to be a legal framework in place, first and foremost. Not only would the kafala system have to be abolished, but there would have to be consequences for perpetrators of these crimes. So until those two things are realized, unfortunately, on a social level, I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Okay. We have one comment from one of our participants that I just want to read because I think it's the most genuine way to handle this. And she says, thanks, Dr. Jasmin. Do you think the Western countries have a double standard for human rights? Kafala system is the worst system in the world. I suffer from it in Saudi Arabia, but no one will talk about it or make pressure to change it. So I guess, Jasmin, just if you want to react to that and maybe say anything you might want to about what's going on in other countries in the region.
I think the conversation on Western countries' double standards of human rights is an entirely different webinar, but I think what we will do is we will definitely try and unpack this comment a little bit, not only when it comes to a human rights conversation, but also when it comes to political will and this pressure to change that you talk about as well. Western countries certainly do have a double standard for human rights. Western countries are also countries that have political priorities, bilateral relations, that maintain relations with countries like Saudi Arabia that have been known to be perpetuators of human rights violations for political interests. This is definitely the reality that we're operating in. There's no arguing there. The kafala system is the worst system in the world for migrants, and for particularly migrants that come to countries where they are isolated, not only legally, but don't speak the language, don't understand the culture, and really are, again, they come in this fear as they enter the country as well. Putting pressure to change it is very attached to political will. We have these conversations as we talk about refugees as well. We see that international refugee law can be applied when there's political will to do so. There's in fact nothing easier, right? Let's, draw the conversation a little bit towards this refugee question, and then bring it back to migrant domestic workers as another vulnerable group that is, a victim of this political will as well. I give this example to my students all the time. The Syrian war produced 6 million refugees in 10 years. The Russia-Ukraine war produced 6 million refugees in 2 months. Somehow, we have found a solution for the 6 million Ukrainian refugees. We've provided them with protection, integration. We've provided them with schooling and employment. And then somehow the 6 million refugees that are housed, by the way, predominantly, more than 90% of them in 3 countries in the Middle East, are seen to be a threat to the refugee system, a threat to the European Union, a threat to the world, right? So we come to the conclusion that conversations on migration crises are hardly ever a number game. It's really more of an identity game, isn't it? It's more of a political will conversation. Very similar to conversations on kafala. Where are the political priorities of the countries that host these groups? In Lebanon, for example, there are absolutely no interests for the Lebanese government to establish relations with any of these sending countries. Lebanon has hardly any diplomatic relations with countries like Sri Lanka, the Philippines, Bangladesh, Eritrea, Ethiopia. The political prioritization is simply not there. They're not seen as mutually beneficial relations on the end of Lebanon. So nothing pushes them to change this. On the other hand, every other migrant that works in Lebanon, if you're predominantly perceived to be white, if you're European, if you're from a developed country, you're integrated, you're given a visa, you're treated differently. You're also even paid more as a foreigner or as a migrant laborer in Lebanon, even in the GCC, because you're perceived to be a little bit more special than everybody else. So I think as we talk about conversations on pressure, we have to really talk about the political will behind human rights, and particularly how politicized migration is on a global scale. We talk about this each and every day. We wish that migration and refugee law were a human rights question. They're a very political question. So while I don't think we're going to solve this, in this webinar today, I think the discourse really needs to shift in that direction, in separating humanitarian arguments and human rights arguments from the political will that either drives this or halts this as well. I hope I responded adequately to your comment. Please, you can ask me anything you'd like.
Sure, thank you. We have someone who's asked a 3-part question, or made, it's 3-part question. One is just to say that this person is aware of situations in which domestic workers are actually treated well in countries. They're actually treated as part of the family, and this abuse isn't taking place. And just wonder, how common do you think this was? Obviously, you found 68% of the women had experienced sexual violence, but did you get stories like that? Secondly, is it less likely that anything's going to be done about this in the intersectional crisis that Lebanon is going through, as you referred to at the beginning? Or is the situation that women are experiencing even worse because of everything else that's going on? And the third is about younger people. Is there a generation coming up in Lebanon that might look at this differently? Or is this so normalized and so deeply embedded that that's unlikely to change?
Wow, so many good questions. Okay, I'll start with the first one. There are definitely a lot of positive stories about women who have incredibly positive experiences in their line of work. They do become part of the family. Some of the women we spoke to, again, we found that 68% had a negative experience. So the other big significant percentage had a very positive one, did not have any negative story to share with us. On the contrary, many women, particularly young women, who had lied about their age, who were really kids, who were 14 and 15 and 16, that came to Enyalanya outside even the scope of this study. Again, we only interviewed women that were above the age of 18, but also said that they were very comfortable where they were, that the lady that hired them felt like a mother figure, and they had a very positive experience along those lines. Those are also very isolated cases and isolated experiences, but they're definitely there, even if it's not the majority of the cases in that regard. I will say, tying to your last question on the generation that might look at it differently, I think this has a lot to do with it. I think the significant percentage of people that are having positive experiences is very tied to an upcoming generation that is more aware of human rights, that is less racist, that is less okay with this conversation on you having someone that cleans up after you, right? A lot of the young women in their households standing up to their mothers and fathers on how they treat their migrant domestic worker. And we've heard a lot of these stories as well. So I do agree that there is a generation that might look at this differently and that continues to look at this differently. Interestingly enough, the anti-racism movement, the Migrant Community Center, and a few organizations that focus on migrant domestic workers' rights are very youth-led. Everyone in the organization is under the age of 35. So I think this is a very big indication, definitely, that the mindset is changing. Interestingly enough, not just generationally changing, but I would also say changing on a social level in the feminist movement. The feminist movement in Lebanon has become much more inclusive of different groups of women. And I think this has also been quite a positive component when we discuss migrant domestic workers and their rights. On your second question on things being less likely to be dealt with in light of Lebanon's intersectional crisis, we unfortunately, yes, we navigate this every day. Wow, aren't you glad now that I coughed that I'm behind the screen? Everybody would have been I mean, we always make this hierarchy of vulnerabilities, right? So in Lebanon, if you are a woman, you are vulnerable. If you are a woman who is not Lebanese, you are more vulnerable. If you are a woman who is not Lebanese and part of a gender minority, for instance, you are even more vulnerable. And if you are a woman who is not Lebanese, perhaps part or not part of a gender minority, but part of a migrant or refugee group, you are the most vulnerable, right? So as we have conversations on economic realities in the country, on economic crises, on political stagnation, on electing a president, on figuring out how our currency is worth, yes, unfortunately, when you approach the Ministry of Labor or the Ministry of Social Affairs and you want to have these conversations with them, they tell you they're not ready to have them yet. But I wish I could say that this was strict to this period, that this has been the case since 2019 when things got bad. Unfortunately, this has always been the case. It is just, once again, going back to this question on political will and prioritization, it just never was a priority. Lebanon hosts 1.5 million Syrian refugees, 500,000 Palestinian refugees, in addition to about 80,000 Palestinian refugees from Syria, and close to 500,000 migrant domestic workers. And it is not signatory to the Refugee or the Migrant Convention, is completely detached from both of these realities, one for strategic political reasons and one for strategic political indifference. It's just not a priority. And so, again, I wish I could say that it's less likely during this period. It's just less likely in general that these conversations unfortunately make it to the table. In Lebanon, as women on a personal status law level, we are, as Lebanese women, unable to give nationality to our children. We are isolated from inheritance laws. Up until a few years ago, we couldn't open a bank account without the signatory of a father or a husband. A woman can still not open a bank account for her child without her husband's signature, without his father's signature or her father's signature. And so women already are navigating a lot of restrictions along those lines. Add all of these intersections we're talking about, and then unfortunately the conversation doesn't really have the space to be had yet. Women experience this worse. I wrote down, I'm trying to remember the third question. So I think we did 1, 2, and 4. There was one more question in there that I took poor notes on.
No, actually, those were the three questions. It was, the third one was around young people. There's another question from a participant about, are all domestic workers migrants? You know, is there a category of Lebanese women that take on these jobs, and are they in a completely different category? And then related to the last points you made, is the economic crisis, would it be moving toward a direction where there wouldn't be migrant domestic workers, but maybe more domestic workers? Or is that just not something that happens?
Absolutely great questions. There are many Lebanese women that engage in domestic work. However, they do this in a very gray legal system. So often enough, they do this very informally. So they're either working in homes, working in a freelance capacity, working per hour. So they're not really protected by the labor law in the sense that they have a wage and holidays and a pension. And they're also not under the kafala system because of the fact that they are Lebanese and they don't fall under the nationalities that the kafala system governs. So they essentially do this job largely in legal limbo, unless they are hired by a big company that actually, provides them with their rights as well. But these big companies have been known to hire migrant domestic workers and not local domestic workers because they are cheaper labor and they can actually hire more migrants than locals for the same amount of money. A lot of refugees also, on a side note, previously were not engaged in migrant domestic labor, are very engaged in migrant domestic labor as well. On the question of whether or not migrant domestic workers will become obsolete, or this will maybe, decrease the numbers, this is a very valid assumption. So COVID-19 followed by the Beirut blast and intersecting with the financial and economic crisis drove a lot of domestic workers out of the country. They returned to their home countries, or they went to Gulf Cooperation Council countries, so the GCC countries. The numbers have not drastically decreased, unfortunately, and we found that to be because of two things. First and foremost, migrant domestic workers who are undocumented do not have their necessary paperwork, their passports to travel, and their consulates and embassies here are not very helpful along those lines. There was an increase certainly in undocumented migrant domestic workers amid this intersectional crisis because they fled the homes of their employers who were otherwise not paying them because they said they couldn't afford it or paying them very little in light of the devaluation of currency. And one of the other reasons why migrant domestic workers have not fled the country in big numbers is because of the fact that they are essentially trapped in the homes of their employers with their passports in a safe somewhere, right? So there's a lot of security issues attached to why they haven't been able to leave in big numbers. And there's also a link between them being undocumented and not having paperwork to begin with. I will say certainly a big number of migrant domestic workers left, but nothing at the magnitude at which you would expect in light of an economic crisis like this.
Related to your comment that the consular services in Lebanon aren't very helpful to these workers, there's a question about, are there any protection efforts from the originating countries like Bangladesh, Philippines? Is there any even protests about how people are being treated, or information to women before they leave about what might happen? Do you know of any efforts that way?
So I always get this question. It's very interesting because it places the blame game in a little more even way as well, right? A lot of the countries that migrant domestic workers come from, particularly Ethiopia, the Philippines, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, rely on remittances from these women for a very significant portion of their GDP. A lot of the families in these countries have at least one person abroad, sending money back. And so the country largely benefits, the sending country largely benefits from having these women abroad. It has been our finding and our understanding that when these women seek the help of their consulates and their embassies in Lebanon, that there's a blind eye that's turned and there's not a lot of support that's there. With the exception of the COVID pandemic, where a lot of the embassies and consulates flew their citizens back. Aside from that, the consulates and embassies have not been known to be helpful along those lines. I will say that the Philippines a few years ago banned their citizens from coming to Lebanon because of the dire situation for migrant domestic workers and a lot of the news that they were hearing about the human rights violations perpetuated against them. And now, in response to this, Filipino migrant domestic workers are some of the most smuggled migrant domestic workers and trafficked domestic workers into the country, because now they resort to these routes to make it into Lebanon and other countries as well. Interestingly enough, our paper caused a little bit of protests in Ethiopia because the director of Enialenia, who is, the partnering organization on this paper, gave an interview in Ethiopia. It pushed people to get on the streets. The paper got a little bit of attention, but did it have, ripple effects in shifting policy or bilateral relations, or the Ethiopian government calling these women and men back? No, it did not. I think it's for the first reason we talked about. A lot of these countries are very developing, are conflict-ridden, and rely heavily on remittances. I could make this argument for Lebanon. Lebanon has twice as many Lebanese citizens outside the country as it does inside the country. As Lebanese people are, exaggerators. Some people say there's 10 times more Lebanese people outside the country. That's like when you say to somebody that you've been waiting for them for 5 hours when you've been downstairs for 5. It's a very Lebanese thing, right? But the numbers are inflated nonetheless. There are millions and millions of Lebanese people around the world in the diaspora that send remittances back to the country, and remittances constituted 27% of our GDP a few years ago. So the Lebanese government was not really interested in what these people were doing. Was not really asking too many questions. They were just happy with the remittances. And I find that these are the circumstances in a lot of the sending countries as well. So I think that's the main point to be made there. The sending countries benefit too much from having these migrant domestic workers in these dire circumstances.
I think that's a fascinating point. Going back to the mental health issues, Jasmin, you said that most of the migrant women resort to informal means to keep their sanity, peer groups or prayer, or are there any attempts among the NGOs to build on those, like to expand that kind of support to the women, or do you see that happening?
No, certainly. So a lot of organizations have definitely picked up on these informal groups, these informal sharing and safe spaces, and a lot of them have been really integrated into programming for different organizations. So organizations like Caritas, for instance, that run shelters for these women now hold these sessions as part of the rehabilitation of these women or their time with them. They hold these open sessions as well. Speaking to someone from Caritas, actually for another study, for an evaluation, their most successful program is really that group session. It's not so much the one-on-one session. It's a group session where she said in many instances, we let the women speak even in their local language and their local dialect, whereby the facilitator doesn't even understand what's happening, but she can see that they're getting things off their chest and they're a lot more comfortable. Efforts to bring in translators as well has been the case, because not only do these group sessions provide that safe space for conversations on mental health, but also speaking in their local language was proven to be a very interesting component of how much they can vent and how much better they can feel. So a lot of organizations actually have been tapping into their resources in order to ensure that there were translators there. For our study, for instance, all the women that were interviewed in their local language. None of them were interviewed in Arabic, English, or French. Every group of women interviewed was interviewed by someone from their community in the language that they were comfortable in. And this not only assisted in the richness of findings, but also made the women much more comfortable with speaking with someone from their community in their language than they would have been if I walked in with my clipboard, right, and started to talk to them. So there's definitely a lot of important conducive environments for this type of healing, right, especially when we talk about mental health, where women are provided not only a space where they recognize other women and feel connected to other women and feel like they share experiences with other women, but also where they can speak their own local languages and express themselves fully. A lot of the challenges that migrant domestic workers have with local authorities is their inability to express to them, their inability to explain the situation in detail to them, their inability to really relay the messages that they want to get across. And this has not only made, ISF officers dismiss them or made the support that they receive a lot more limited, it has also had implications on their mental health as well. One of the Filipino women that I actually interviewed said that if I could express myself fluently in Arabic, my message would get across a lot better. I just can't tell them everything I want to say to them in Arabic. I mean, I have a basic knowledge of the language. So yes, these group sessions and linguistic components were very positive components of programming for different organizations at the moment. Yeah.
Just to be clear, if a woman has had enough and can't take it anymore and goes to authorities and says, I just want to go home, she is just sent back to her sponsor. I mean, there's no like, okay, you can just leave because she has no passport. So literally
Not
there.
just she has no passport. Yeah, no, I mean, not just she has no passport, he also, or she also, whoever has signed off on her employment has legal authority over this person for the duration of the contract. So if you go to a recruitment agency and you want to hire a migrant domestic worker and you want to sponsor him or her for 2 years, you are then entitled to have them present in your home for 2 years, regardless of what the situation is. And a lot of the times, because the ISF is also not trained on what to do in instances of domestic violence and GBV, let alone sexual harassment and sexual violence as well, not only do they not know how to deal with these cases, they think that they're doing the right thing, right? They're following the law. They're sending these women back to where they need to go. By the way, on a side note, in Lebanon, if you're also a woman that is experiencing GBV or any kind of sexual violence within your home, you are likely to be sent back to your father's or husband's home as well. It's a practice in Lebanon, unfortunately, and this extends even more drastically to migrants as well.
We have an interesting question related to the US, asking if you have any thoughts about the recent Biden administration invitation, in quotes, to individuals in the private sector to sponsor immigrants as a way of relieving overburdened resettlement organizations. And this participant is concerned that this may lead to similar conditions for migrant workers, and wonders, how did the kafala system begin?
Well, I'm glad the question didn't end at, do you have any opinions on the Biden administration? Because I don't think we have enough time for that question. But on the specific question of, yes, the sponsorship system, it is a very, very similar replica of the kafala system along those lines. And our understanding of this is that it could lead largely to smugglers and traffickers making this very much of a business to bring people in on this sponsorship program, similar to how people in Lebanon have opened these recruitment agencies, have now these smuggling and trafficking networks along those lines as well. I'm not saying that it will, it's just a very conducive environment for this to happen because we see it happen in the GCC all the time. We see it happen in Lebanon all the time as well. This sponsorship system could have pros and cons, certainly, but if, you know, practice has taught us anything and the kafala system has taught us anything, is that this system is largely abused. And not only largely abused, it has been utilized as a means by our government, at least, to be strategically indifferent towards what's going on and to kind of turn a blind eye towards what's going on, to alleviate themselves from this notion of responsibility. So it's recruitment agencies bringing these women in. And so the Ministry of Labor and other government entities and the government as a whole doesn't feel responsible for these women. In fact, when issues like the COVID vaccine rolling out came into play, the government said that all citizens and refugees would have access to the vaccine, forgot to even mention migrant domestic workers. Wasn't even part of the official statement, right? So do I see the possibility for this to happen? Maybe. Not to compare, of course, the level of organization and administration and grandness of the US administration, not comparing it to Lebanon's failed administrations in any sense, but there are always people that are going to want to navigate the system and make it work in their favor. And this definitely is an environment that could permit for that, in my opinion.
We have several comments, Jasmin, about what a moving analysis this has been and not the usual report on research, which I think everyone appreciates and is struck by. But there's a couple of questions just about, well, what can people outside Lebanon do to help? I mean, what can, is it replicating your research other places? Is it trying to, you know, what can we do, I guess is the question from your point of view.
I think there's a few things that can be done, and I think one of them is placing migrant domestic workers on the priorities in the research agenda, right? So we all come from very solidly funded universities that have some sort of agency in the research that we conduct and the stories that we tell. So I think placing this on the priorities in the research agenda, similar to the way your center is doing this, similar to why we're having this talk today. We tend to sway in very conventional directions as we talk about migrant health. We tend to go for conversations on refugees because that's where the funding is. We tend to go for conversations on different groups and where the funding sways us as well. So I think placing this group of migrants that is largely understudied, continues to be really on our priority list would be one thing. Another thing would be that when we do place them on our priority list, that we ensure that the research is participatory, that we don't conduct research on this group, but rather with this group. When we were doing the literature review for our study, we found that the biggest study on migrant domestic workers and gender-based violence or sexual harassment or sexual violence interviewed 25 migrant domestic workers at most. That was a big study. Others interviewed 5 domestic workers and 25 experts on sexual violence and migration, which I'm sure have very valuable things to say, but in real, I would say, application, how impactful is your study and how true is it if these testimonies are missing? So I would say, first and foremost, placing this group of migrants on the research agenda. And second would be to ensure that the research is as participatory as possible, that the women are not only participating in the research, but are also part of the experience, part of the journey and the findings of the research as well. At our conference, our dissemination conference for this research, I spoke for 5 minutes, and then we had a panel of migrant domestic workers that got to, for the first time, stand up in front of a room of policymakers and embassy representatives and even ambassadors of certain countries, including the American embassy as well that sent a representative, and were able to speak to them directly. And they had never even been in a room with these people. They had never been able to speak to anyone so directly at all. They've barely been able to speak to a police officer. So I think fostering these types of environments will sway the conversation. I think the progress that we've made in the areas of refugee studies happened a lot quicker and a lot more exponentially than the progress we've made in the areas of this group in particular. And I think it has a lot to do with the type of research we're conducting and the priorities that we have as well.
I think that's a really good point. There's an additional question about these recruiting agencies. Jasmin, are they licensed or regulated? Or I guess it's also a cautionary tale for this, what might happen in the US. You know, these, are they licensed and or regulated in any way?
They are licensed, but not regulated. In Lebanon, those are two very different things, right? So they can have their paperwork in order, but then beyond the initial registration and the initial attempt to register themselves as this agency, the follow-up, the monitoring, the evaluation, the transparency is all really not there. So what happens is these recruitment agencies are involved in legal activity as a front where you can go and you can, hire a migrant domestic worker through the agency, but they're also known to be involved in trafficking and smuggling rings as well, particularly with networks that we found exist even in the home country of these women. So you will find a recruitment agency in Lebanon that has very legal activity, but also very illegal activity and relations with other agencies and networks that are part of countries that are from countries where these women are from. So like Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sri Lanka, even the Philippines as well. This usually happens when women come to Lebanon under the pretense that they're going to do migrant domestic work, but then they are engaged in other forms of work, particularly illicit forms of work. A lot of women had discussed that they had been smuggled into Lebanon under the pretense that they would be working in migrant domestic work, but ended up working in prostitution, ended up working in sex work, ended up working in a strip club, ended up working as a smuggler, as a drug dealer, etc. We've heard stories that you can't imagine, and they're all happening on the sidelines of this front of, these agencies that are registered, etc. One of the women actually went back home to the Philippines and attempted to sue a recruitment agency. Unfortunately failed, but did attempt to sue the recruitment agency for the false pretenses that she was brought in on. So we see this all the time. There is some kind of a system to register these agencies, certainly, but there's also no cap on how many of these agencies can exist. You can register as many agencies as you want. In the GCC at the moment, we know that there are attempts to regulate how many agencies are licensed, how many agencies are permitted, and really to crack down a little bit on the smuggling and trafficking component. The GCC has been doing a good job on this, or at least is headed in the right direction along these lines. Even we brought up Saudi Arabia recently. We consulted to a project. Saudi Arabia wants to understand what's happening there. Lebanon does not. Lebanon does not.
Mhm. Okay, and I guess related to this, is there a way to kind of contrast good actors with bad actors in this business?
I mean, can you do that in any business? You know, it's really unfortunately down to these individual positive experiences that we're talking about. A lot of women have very positive experiences. They come through a recruitment agency that is very nice to them, very kind and transparent with them. They get placed at a home that they love the family. There are, you know, evil people in this business and very great people that are advocates of human rights as well. It's just the percentages that we're worried about, right? It's just that it's less likely for you to be a recruitment agency that upholds human rights principles than you are otherwise. Some of these recruitment agencies are known to keep women, you know, 15 women, 20 women at a time in the same room, are known to torture these women, not feed them. Like, we've heard stories that are absolutely detrimental. These agencies can go either way, unfortunately. And there's no way for migrant domestic workers to know what type of agency they're dealing with before they enter Lebanon. I think this is the problem. But as far as spotting them, I unfortunately wouldn't have any information on that, although I will report certainly that we've heard very positive experiences alongside very negative experiences as well.
Okay, I think another issue that's certainly at the Center for Immigrant, Refugee, and Global Health, and we also have a Center for Innovation in Mental Health. I guess this question would come from our concern that really the mental health of migrants is given more attention. I mean, this group is particularly understudied, as you said, but in general, the mental health of migrants is not given very much attention. You know, it's more life-saving support or their legal status, or and the flows of Ukrainians into neighboring countries. It's kind of giving this a little more visibility because they're flowing into Europe, and there's a little more attention to the mental health needs of migrants. But is your research also feeding into a growing body of literature on the need to look at mental health?
No, of course. We work on migrant domestic workers' mental health as well as refugee mental health. And we work on, of course, many intersections, as we do with you as well in the project that we work on also intersectional vulnerabilities under each group. So gender identity and refugees and the impact on mental health, as well as migrant domestic workers and their gender expression and their gender identities and that impact on mental health. As we said, the vulnerability that we're talking about, unfortunately, can be very layered for different people within the community. And I think what's complex about migrant domestic workers and addressing their mental health is that they are even less of a homogenous group than refugees, right? So we're talking about women and men from 20 plus different nationalities, from very different parts of the world that have had very different experiences, very different journeys, very different understandings of where they're going. They come from very different religious backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, etc. We make the argument that the refugee community is not as homogenous as we think. So you can only imagine how much the migrant domestic working community provides this, I would say, complex question to health experts and to mental health experts more specifically. My friend who's a mental health expert actually said this to me quite pertinently. She said, at least if I'm speaking to a Syrian refugee, no matter what type of person I'm speaking to, what kind of identities or expressions this person has, I know what they were fleeing. I understand the conflict, at least. That's one conflict, right? That whole group is fleeing one conflict. At least that helps me create some kind of a baseline when I talk to them about their trauma and their mental health. For migrant domestic workers, the group is so diverse that while we attempt to place them under one umbrella under the kafala system, there's so much to unpack there. And this makes conversations on mental health even more challenging as well. going back to what you said, there is definitely a need to explore mental health in general in Lebanon on a national scale and in the region as well. We've only recently started to have staff like school counselors in schools or psychologists in schools or conversations on mental health in general. Interestingly enough, it's not always I would say, to play it a little bit, to give even weight to both of the situations that we looked at when we saw that migrant domestic workers were not accessing mental health services. One of them is, of course, this, environment that we're talking about, where mental health services are not available and accessible. But another one was a conversation on how hesitant they were about accessing these services, even if they were granted access to these services. A lot of the women telling us things like, oh, if my mom ever found out I saw a psychologist, that would be so shameful. We don't do that in our family. What are psychologists going to do that my friend can't do? I can talk to my friend about it. I don't need to go talk to a stranger about it. If you send me to a psychologist and I talk to her for an hour, what's that going to do? I'm still going to go back to the situation that I'm in. So I think it's twofold. There's a need to address the mental health question on multiple fronts, not just to make the environment enabling, but also to communicate with this group about mental health differently. And this is what we're trying to do. A lot of the work that we're exploring with different organizations will be a little bit more in the areas of building capacities and discussing these different topics with migrant groups, particularly migrant domestic workers as well.
Great. I know that our colleague that works very closely on the project also wanted to make a comment. Dima, did you want to say something?
Yes, I guess I just wanted to see a bit of a silver lining here. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I've seen a documentary in Lebanon where, in light of the extreme economic crisis, people had to let go their domestic migrant workers. And in a few cases, the workers refused to leave. They stayed and they felt like this was their family, their mothers, their sisters, and they just stayed and they're not being paid. And I guess I'm just trying to see the positive out of the 68% that, the majority does not experience that. But I wanted to see what you thought of that and if you encountered anything similar.
So I think, okay, and this is, of course, because I've spoken so much to the community, I don't want to speak on behalf of anyone, but in our experience, the women we've spoken to have stayed behind for two reasons. One of them being, yes, that they feel maybe connected to the family in very rare cases, and they feel like that's their home. But also, we've received a counter question from them when we ask them why they stay, and they're like, so where am I going to go? If I don't stay, where do I go? Do I go back to my country that also has very dire circumstances and dire conditions? Do I go back to the rural area that I'm from to live with my parents again, or to live with an abusive spouse, or to live with, 50 of my family members in a pandemic that's probably more mismanaged, for instance, than in Lebanon, in an economic crisis that is probably worse in my country of origin? So for a lot of women that we've spoken to, one woman describes it as the lesser of two evils, right? She says, I have a roof over my head. I have meals, I have a bed, even if they're not paying me, this is the best I can do at the moment. And so I'm going to stay. Yes, a lot of the women feel like they are part of the family, etc. But I think those two things are not mutually exclusive, right? So feeling like you're part of the family would also make you feel like it's the safer option, even if you're not being paid, feeling like the people that hired you are maternal and paternal figures, are sisterly figures, etc. So I think these two things are very linked. I just don't think that, yes, one of them, that component on staying behind, doesn't have also other considerations in the minds of those migrants, other than these people are really nice to me and I feel at home, right? I just think it's a little bit twofold, and it's been that complex when we ask people. Again, we're shot with the question of, we have nowhere to go back to, so why would we not stay, right? So I think that's maybe something that we need to keep in mind as well. Yeah. Also, who made that documentary? Do you know?
I can look it up and send it to you.
Because I'm interested to see who the entity is. Yeah, I haven't seen it. Thank you, Dima.
Absolutely.
Great, Jasmine. I think it's we're going to be wrapping up. So I wonder if there's any last comments that you want to make before Jim and I try to summarize this fascinating conversation. So over to you for any last points.
To me, wow, I think,
Anything we didn't ask that you think is important to
well,
add?
honestly, I think I mean, I did attempt to summarize a very big conversation in a small talk, but I think we covered so much ground with the questions, and I thank everybody so much for their engagement, and Kathleen for your moderation as well. I think one closing statement would be probably just really going back to what can be done, you know, beyond these talks. I really just hope that if anything sticks with you today, it's that conversation on prioritizing this group in research and also including them in a participatory approach in research moving forward as well. That's what we're trying to do at our institute, and are happy to collaborate and work with anyone that feels the same or has the same priorities as us. I thank you so much for this platform, and thank you for all your questions again. Thanks.
Thank you, Jasmine. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. And thanks for being open and so flexible just to take as many questions as we had. I really want to thank participants for the great questions that were coming through as you were speaking and answering other questions. I think it's impossible to summarize what we heard. I think many of us were very moved by what we heard. I think at least 3 things I'd offer. I think it's been important to spend an hour and a half thinking about this group. As you said, I think they're understudied. I think they're invisible. They're invisible in our own society, and we understand how invisible they are, and wherever they are. Secondly, I think the whole idea of people being isolated by design and by law, and the impact that that has on their mental health has been something that's really come through very, very clearly. And I guess the third point I would make is, as you made, what can be done. And I guess it's to focus a little bit more on those who are not getting any attention at all, maybe stretching beyond our comfort zone of where the money is or what research might land better in different situations, and to really look at the marginalized of the marginalized, which is, I think, the group we focused on today. And it's just even a greater pleasure and privilege to call you a colleague, Jasmin, after today. So thank you very much. And the domestic workers of Lebanon and the world couldn't have a better advocate than we heard tonight. Over to Jim for a final word.
Well, it'll just be that, just to thank you, Jasmin. Again, this is, you know, again, it keeps it keeps the blood flowing and the energy going in terms of how vividly you bring your research into the narrative, and it's wonderful. I do want to emphasize that the common bridging here, you know, even in these rural places in Western New York, increasingly in this common element of the particular vulnerability for young people who don't have any form of documentation, and that the increasing majority now of young people who are in essence, the child advocacy centers, the protection centers, are actually undocumented, mostly from our southern border, but not just, but they're undocumented young people, and the particular vulnerability that puts them at is something that should give us pause. So there is no summarizing, as Kathleen said, it's just more work to be done. And so we just look forward to continuing to join with you in this and find new ways to work on these issues. Again, thanks to everybody for tuning in and participating. And I'm sure there'll be more that we'll be hearing from Jasmin here and elsewhere in the months and years to come.
Thank you very much, Jasmin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmin.
Thank you so much, everybody. I'm so glad
Thank
my
you.
connection held up to the end of this. I'm really happy. Thank you so much.
Thank
Have a
you,
nice
everyone.
day.
Bye.